The studio lights blazed down on the question time set as Judge Robert Rinder sat calmly in his chair, his sharp suit perfectly pressed, eyes focused like a laser. Across from him, Nigel Farage leaned back with that familiar smirk, thinking he was about to school this television judge on real politics. What happened in the next 30 seconds would leave the entire audience gasping and send shockwaves across British television. Farage had just finished his usual rant about establishment elites when he made the fatal mistake of pointing directly at Rinder and declaring, "You sit there in your fancy robes judging ordinary people, but what do you really know about the struggles of working-class Britain?" The audience fell silent. Rinder's eyebrows raised slightly, and for a moment, you could hear a pin drop. Then came the response that nobody saw coming, a comeback so brutal, so perfectly timed, that it would become the most watched political moment of the year. Farage's confident grin vanished in an instant, replaced by the look of a man who had just walked into a buzzsaw. The audience erupted, and social media exploded. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that like button if you want to see more political moments like this. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest drama from British politics. This wasn't just a debate, it was a masterclass in how to handle a political bully, delivered by someone who spends his days dealing with people who think they're smarter than they actually are. And Farage was about to learn that lesson the hard way. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to know who these two men really are. Judge Robert Rinder isn't just some television personality playing dress-up. This is a man who graduated from Cambridge University, served as a criminal barrister for over a decade, and built his reputation tearing apart liars and fraudsters in actual courtrooms. His ITV show might seem light entertainment, but underneath that sharp wit is a legal mind that can spot BS from a mile away. Rinder's background tells the real story. Born to a working-class Jewish family, his grandfather was a Holocaust survivor who came to Britain with nothing. Rinder worked his way up through the British legal system the hard way, no silver spoon, no family connections, just pure talent and determination. When he speaks about justice and fairness, it comes from real experience, not political soundbites. On the other side sat Nigel Farage, the man who built his entire career on claiming to speak for ordinary people, while living anything but an ordinary life. Private school educated, former commodities trader in the City of London, Main P for over 20 years, collecting EU paychecks while campaigning to leave the EU. Farage had mastered the art of political theatre, always ready with a pint and a populist slogan. But here's what made this confrontation so significant. Farage had been on a roll lately. His Reform UK party was gaining ground in the polls, and he'd been using every television appearance to attack what he called the metropolitan elite: judges, lawyers, academics, anyone who dared question his politics. He'd grown comfortable being the loudest voice in the room, used to shouting down opponents with his trademark bluster. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This was primetime BBC, millions watching, and both men knew that a single moment could define how the public saw them. Farage needed to maintain his image as the fearless truth-teller taking on the establishment. Rinder, meanwhile, represented everything Farage claimed to oppose: educated, articulate, and completely unimpressed by political grandstanding. The tension in the studio was electric. You could see it in the way the other panelists shifted in their seats, in how the audience leaned forward, sensing that something big was about to happen. Fiona Bruce, the host, tried to maintain control, but even she could feel the atmosphere charging like the air before a thunderstorm. What made this moment even more powerful was the contrast between the two men. Farage, animated and gesticulating, his voice rising as he made his points about real people and genuine concerns. Rinder, sitting perfectly still, listening with the patience of someone who had heard every excuse, every justification, every attempt to twist the truth that existed. This wasn't just political theatre, this was about credibility, authenticity, and who really had the right to speak for British values. And the audience was about to witness a collision between two completely different ideas of what leadership looks like. The debate had started innocently enough, with a question about immigration policy from a concerned mother in the audience. She spoke about her local school being overwhelmed and wondered what could be done. It was exactly the kind of question Farage lived for: personal, emotional, and politically charged. Farage immediately seized the microphone, launching into his well-rehearsed routine about uncontrolled borders and cultural concerns. His voice carried that familiar tone, part anger, part resignation, as if he was the only person brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths. His hands moved as he spoke, gesticulating with the practiced ease of someone who'd given this speech 1,000 times before. "The British people are fed up," Farage declared, his finger jabbing the air for emphasis. "They're fed up with being lectured by people who live in their ivory towers, completely disconnected from the reality of modern Britain." The audience stirred, some nodding in agreement, others looking skeptical. A few crossed their arms, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. Judge Rinder remained silent, but his expression was telling. Anyone who knew courtroom dynamics could recognize the look, the same expression he wore when listening to a defendant dig themselves into a deeper hole with every word. His fingers were steepled in front of him, his head tilted slightly, like a predator watching prey that didn't know it was being hunted. He was letting Farage build his case, gathering ammunition for what was coming. The other panelists, a Labour MP, a Conservative minister, and a journalist all looked increasingly uncomfortable. They'd seen Farage in action before, but there was something different about tonight. He seemed more aggressive, more willing to push boundaries. Perhaps it was the polls showing Reform UK gaining ground, or maybe it was the confidence that came from years of getting away with provocative statements. Farage, emboldened by what he mistook for submission from Rinder, cranked up the volume. "We have immigration running at unsustainable levels. We have communities that no longer recognize themselves. And meanwhile, the establishment just tells us to shut up and accept it." Applause rippled through parts of the audience. Farage was in his element now, feeding off the energy, his voice rising with each phrase. "Look at London," he continued, warming to his theme. "Look at Birmingham. Look at Leicester. These aren't the places I grew up knowing. The culture has changed. The language has changed. And if you dare mention it, if you dare say you're concerned about the pace of change, you're immediately branded a bigot." But then he made his first mistake. Looking directly at Rinder, his eyes narrowing with calculated malice, he added, "I suppose you'd call anyone concerned about immigration a racist, wouldn't you, Judge? That's what your type always does, shut down debate with name-calling." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Rinder's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he remained silent. His expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted the way a big cat might shift its weight before pouncing. Fiona Bruce tried to give him a chance to respond, but Rinder simply gestured for Farage to continue. "It was a masterclass in rope-giving. Let your opponent hang themselves with their own words." The Labour MP tried to interject, but Farage was on a roll now, his voice growing louder and more passionate. No, I want to hear from the judge. I want to hear him defend the system that's failed so many British families." Farage, interpreting the silence as weakness, pressed harder. His confidence was growing with each unanswered attack. "You see, this is exactly the problem. The legal establishment, the judicial system, they're all part of the same metropolitan bubble. They make decisions about ordinary people's lives without having the faintest idea what those lives are actually like." He stood up slightly, leaning forward in his chair, his voice taking on a preacher-like quality. "They live in their comfortable houses in expensive neighborhoods. They send their children to private schools. And then they lecture the rest of us about tolerance and diversity from their position of complete safety." The audience was getting restless now. Some were nodding more vigorously, caught up in Farage's rhythm. Others were shifting uncomfortably, sensing that something unpleasant was building. The cameras kept cutting between faces, some animated with agreement, others troubled by the escalating rhetoric. The tension was building like pressure in a kettle, and everyone could feel it. A middle-aged woman in the front row was shaking her head, clearly disagsted. Behind her, a young man was filming on his phone, recognizing that something significant was happening. The Conservative minister looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, while the journalist was scribbling notes furiously. Farage, now fully committed to his attack, turned his attention back to Rinder with renewed vigor. "And that's the real problem with this country. We have a two-tier system where the people making the decisions, the judges, the lawyers, the civil servants, they never have to live with the consequences of those decisions." His voice was reaching crescendo now, filled with the righteous indignation that had made him famous. "They talk about community cohesion from their gated communities. They talk about integration from their all-white dinner parties. They talk about the benefits of diversity while ensuring their own children never have to experience the chaos they've created. The studio was electric with tension now. You could see it in the way people sat forward in their seats, in the way conversations stopped in the production gallery, in the way even the camera operators seemed more focused. This wasn't just political debate anymore, this was personal, and everyone knew it. Rinder remained motionless throughout this onslaught, his expression never changing, but anyone watching closely might have noticed the slightest tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set just a fraction more firmly. He was a man listening to every word, cataloging every assumption, every insult, every piece of ammunition being handed to him. Then came Farage's fatal error, standing up from his chair completely now, pointing directly at Rinder with theatrical flourish, his voice dripping with disdain and absolute certainty. He delivered the line that would destroy him. "You sit there in your fancy robes judging ordinary people, but what do you really know about the struggles of working-class Britain? What do you know about real work, real sacrifice, real life, outside your comfortable little legal world?" The studio fell dead silent. Not just quiet absolutely, completely silent. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. Every camera was on Rinder now, waiting for his response. The other panelists looked frozen, as if they couldn't quite believe what they'd just witnessed. Farage sat back with that trademark smirk, clearly believing he'd just delivered a knockout blow. His chest was still heaving slightly from the passion of his speech, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who thought they'd just won a decisive victory. He'd used this line before questioning his opponent's credibility, their right to have an opinion, their connection to real people. It had always worked before. But as Rinder slowly straightened in his chair, something in his expression should have warned Farage that he'd just made a catastrophic miscalculation. The judge's eyes sharpened, not with anger but with the cold precision of someone who had just been handed exactly what they needed. His voice, when it came, dropped to that quiet, controlled tone that anyone who'd been in his courtroom would recognize as extremely dangerous. "I'm sorry, Nigel," Rinder said, his voice calm but with steel underneath, each word carefully measured. "Could you repeat that question?" Farage, riding high on adrenaline and missing every warning sign, happily obliged. He even smiled as he repeated the attack, savoring what he thought was his moment of triumph. "I asked what you know about real life, about ordinary people's struggles. You've spent your career in comfortable chambers making comfortable decisions about other people's lives." The audience held its breath. Fiona Bruce leaned forward slightly, her presenter's instincts telling her that something historic was about to happen. The other panelists looked like they wanted to hide under the table. The camera operators zoomed in, sensing the moment, and Judge Robert Rinder smiled the kind of smile that defense lawyers learn to fear. The smile that appears when a prosecutor realizes the defendant has just confessed to everything. What happened next would become the most watched political clip of the year, the moment that proved sometimes the establishment elite isn't the problem. Sometimes the problem is politicians who think they're cleverer than they actually are. Judge Rinder's smile grew wider, but his eyes remained ice cold. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced down murderers and fraudsters, and was completely unimpressed by a politician's bluster. "Well, Nigel," he began, leaning forward slightly, "since you ask about my knowledge of real life and ordinary people's struggles, let me enlighten you." The camera zoomed in on his face as he continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire studio. "My grandfather fled Nazi Germany with nothing but the clothes on his back. He arrived in Britain as a refugee, Nigel, a refugee, and spent the rest of his life grateful to this country for taking him in when others turned him away." Farage's smirk was already beginning to fade, but Rinder was just getting started. "My father worked in a factory, Nigel. Manual labor, shift work, the kind of job that leaves your hands dirty and your back aching. My mother cleaned offices at night to help pay the bills. I grew up in a council house in London, sharing a bedroom with my brother until I was 15. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. You could see Farage's face beginning to change, the confident expression replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like panic. "But here's what you don't understand about real people, Nigel," Rinder continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Real people don't give up when life gets hard. Real people work 2 jobs, study at night, and fight their way up through merit, not by shouting the loudest or blaming their problems on whoever happens to be different from them. The first murmurs of approval began rippling through the audience. Rinder wasn't finished. "I worked in kitchens to pay for university, Nigel. I've cleaned toilets. I've served drinks to people who looked right through me. I've done exactly the kind of work you claim to champion while you were trading commodities in the City of London." Farage tried to interrupt, but Rinder's courtroom training kicked in. When you have momentum, you don't give it up. "And you want to know what I learned in all those years in criminal court? I learned to spot a con artist. I learned to recognize someone who tells people what they want to hear while picking their pockets. I learned that the loudest voice in the room is usually the one with the most to hide." The audience was beginning to stir now, sensing where this was heading. Farage's face had gone from confident to uncomfortable to genuinely worried. "So when you ask me what I know about ordinary people's struggles," Rinder said, his voice rising for the first time, "I'll tell you exactly what I know. I know that ordinary people are smarter than you give them credit for. I know they don't need a privately educated ex-banker to tell them who to blame for their problems. And I know they can spot someone who's built his entire career on division and fear." The studio erupted. Not just applause or roars of approval, people jumping to their feet, cameras panning across faces that showed everything from delight to shock to pure amazement. Fiona Bruce was trying to restore order, but it was hopeless. But Rinder wasn't done. As the noise died down, he delivered the killing blow. "And one more thing, Nigel," he said, his voice deadly quiet again. "Ordinary people know the difference between someone who fights for justice and someone who just fights for votes." The place went absolutely mad. The applause was thunderous, sustained, the kind of reaction that tells you something historic has just happened. Cameras showed audience members wiping their eyes, others standing and clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. Farage sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, looking like a man who'd been hit by a truck he never saw coming. His usual recovery tactics, the bluster, the deflection, the attempt to change the subject all seemed to have abandoned him. For the first time in decades of political combat, Nigel Farage was speechless. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was weak, uncertain. "Well, that's a very personal story, Judge. But nothing," Rinder cut him off, and the authority in his voice was absolute. "You asked me what I know about real life. I've told you. The question now is what you're going to do with that information." The audience was still buzzing, still processing what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a political exchange, this was a complete dismantling, delivered with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly how to cut through political BS and get to the truth. Farage tried once more to regain control. "Look, Judge, I respect your background, but that doesn't change the fact that immigration, Rinder interrupted. "Like the immigration that brought my grandfather here? Like the immigration that helped build this country? Or are you talking about the kind of immigration that only counts as a problem when it's politically convenient for you?" Game over. Farage slumped back in his chair, and for the first time in his political career, he looked defeated. Not just out-argued, completely outclassed by someone who combined legal training with lived experience and an absolutely unshakable moral foundation. The moment would go down as one of the greatest political takedowns in British television history. But more than that, it showed the power of authenticity over rhetoric, experience over bluster, and truth over convenient fiction. The moment question time ended, social media exploded like a bomb had gone off. Within minutes, Rinder destroys Farage was trending across Twitter, with clips of the exchange spreading faster than anyone could count them. The BBC's own social media team posted the key moments almost immediately. And the main clip, Rinder's complete takedown, starting with, "My grandfather fled Nazi Germany, racked up over 50,000 views in the first hour alone. By midnight, it had hit 500,000. Twitter became a battlefield of reactions. Supporters of Rinder flooded the platform with praise. "This is what happens when you bring facts to a feelings fight," wrote one user, whose tweet got over 20,000 likes. Another posted, "Judge Rinder just reminded us what actual working-class success looks like," with a screenshot of Rinder's calm, confident expression during the exchange. The meme started almost immediately. The most popular showed a split screen. Farage's confident smirk at the beginning of the segment next to his stunned, defeated expression at the end, captioned, how it started versus how it ended. Another showed Rinder in his judge's robes with the caption, "Court is now in session," which spread across Instagram and TikTok like wildfire. But it wasn't just social media buzz. Within hours, major news outlets were picking up the story. The Guardian ran with, "Judge Rinder delivers devastating response to Farage's elite jibe." The Telegraph, traditionally more sympathetic to Farage, couldn't ignore the story. Farage left speechless by television judge's personal revelation. Sky News played the clip on repeat throughout their morning programs, with political commentators struggling to find words strong enough to describe what had happened. "I've been covering politics for 30 years, said one veteran journalist, "and I've never seen a more complete demolition of a politician's argument." Farage walked right into that one. The international media picked up the story too. CNN ran it as their lead European political story, with the headline, "British Judge Schools Populist Politician in Viral Television Moment." The clip made it onto American late-night television, with hosts praising Rinder's surgical precision in taking apart Farage's argument. But perhaps the most telling reactions came from within British politics itself. MPs from across the political spectrum were weighing in, many clearly delighted to see Farage taken down a peg. Labour MPs were particularly vocal. "This is what happens when someone with real experience meets someone who just plays one on television," tweeted one backbencher. The Shadow Attorney General posted simply, "Mic drop," with a link to the BBC clip. Even some Conservative MPs, normally careful about criticising fellow Brexit supporters, couldn't resist. One former cabinet minister tweeted, "Regardless of politics, that was a masterclass in how to handle a bully. Well done, Judge Rinder." The Liberal Democrats went further, with their leader posting, "Judge Rinder just reminded us all that real working-class heroes don't need to shout about it, they just get on with making things better." Farage's own supporters were in disarray. His usual social media army seemed stunned into silence for the first few hours. When they did start responding, the messages were notably defensive. "Nigel was just asking legitimate questions," posted one supporter, but even that got ratioed by responses pointing out that Farage had made assumptions, not asked questions. Reform UK's official accounts went quiet for almost 12 hours, an eternity in modern politics. When they finally posted, it was a generic message about media bias that fooled nobody and got hardly any engagement. Farage himself tried to fight back, posting on his personal Twitter account, "Interesting debate with Judge Rinder tonight. Shows the importance of having these conversations." But the response was brutal. Reply after reply showed clips of his defeated expression, with comments like, "That's not what your face said," and "Conversation? You got schooled, mate." The clip became required viewing in law schools across the country. Legal training programs used it as an example of how to systematically dismantle an opponent's argument while maintaining absolute professional composure. "Watch how he lets Farage build his case before destroying every assumption," one professor told her students. That's advocacy at its finest. At Cambridge University, where Rinder had studied, law professors started using the exchange in their rhetoric classes. "Notice how he never raises his voice," explained one lecturer. "The power comes from the facts, delivered with absolute certainty. This is what we mean by letting the evidence speak for itself." Bar associations across the country shared the clip in their training materials. Senior barristers used it to teach junior colleagues about courtroom presence and the importance of preparation. Rinder knew exactly what he was going to say the moment Farage started his attack, noted one QC. "That's what 20 years of legal practice gives you, the ability to stay calm under fire and strike with precision." Medical schools also picked up on the exchange, using it in their communications training. "Look at how he manages his emotional response," one professor pointed out to her students. "He's clearly affected by the personal nature of the attack, but he channels that emotion into a devastating response. That's exactly what we need to teach our doctors about dealing with difficult patients." Comedy panel shows had a field day. Have I Got News for You dedicated an entire segment to the exchange, with Ian Hislop noting, "It's rare to see someone's entire political persona collapse in real time on television. Usually politicians are better at hiding when they're out of their depth." Mock the Week ran an entire segment called Things Nigel Farage is Thinking Right Now, with comedians delivering increasingly panicked internal monologues. The most popular was, "Maybe I should have asked about his qualifications before questioning his qualifications." Saturday Night Live in America featured the exchange in their cold open, with the sketch ending with the fake Farage character saying, "Well, this is awkward. Does anyone know how to resign from television?" Late-night talk shows across Europe picked up the story. In Germany, where Rinder's family history resonated particularly strongly, one host commented, "This is what happens when you attack someone whose family survived what yours enabled. History has a way of coming back to bite you." The exchange also caught the attention of Holocaust education groups worldwide. The Anne Frank Trust used Rinder's story to illustrate how refugee experiences shape character across generations. Judge Rinder's grandfather fled Nazi persecution, and that family history of resistance to tyranny clearly shaped who he became, their statement read. Jewish community leaders across Britain praised Rinder's response. The chief rabbi issued a statement saying, "Judge Rinder's dignified response reminds us that our history of persecution gives us a responsibility to speak up against bullying and prejudice, wherever we find it." Refugee advocacy groups saw the exchange as a powerful moment for their cause. "Judge Rinder's story perfectly illustrates what we've always known," said one spokesperson. "Today's refugees are tomorrow's judges, doctors, teachers, and community leaders. The people fleeing persecution today could be the ones protecting our democracy tomorrow." Educational institutions began incorporating the exchange into their citizenship classes. Teachers used it to discuss immigration, social mobility, and the difference between populism and authentic representation. "Students immediately understand the power dynamics at play," reported one secondary school teacher. "They can see who's speaking from experience and who's performing for votes." The entertainment industry took notice too. Several production companies reached out to Rinder about potential television projects focusing on his background and legal career. Book publishers approached him about expanding his memoir to include more details about his family's refugee experience and his journey through the British class system. International human rights organizations shared the clip as an example of how personal testimony can cut through political rhetoric. Amnesty International used it in their training materials for advocates, showing how authentic experience trumps manufactured outrage every time. Universities across Europe invited Rinder to speak about his experience, both as a legal professional and as the grandson of a refugee. Oxford's Refugee Studies Centre scheduled a lecture series around themes raised by the exchange, examining how refugee experiences shape subsequent generations' approach to justice and public service. The clip even made its way into corporate training programs. Management consultants used it to teach executives about the importance of understanding your audience before making assumptions. Farage's mistake was assuming he knew who he was talking to, explained one business school professor. In the corporate world, that kind of assumption can destroy careers just as quickly. Public speaking coaches across the country started using the exchange to teach their clients about the power of preparation and authenticity. Rinder's response was devastating because it was completely genuine, noted one coach. "You can't fake that kind of authenticity, and you can't prepare for it if you haven't lived it." The moment also sparked broader conversations about class, education, and social mobility in Britain. Sociologists analyzed the exchange as a case study in how different forms of cultural capital, Farage's political connections versus Rinder's legal expertise and personal experience, can clash in public forums. The academic world took notice too. Political science professors used the exchange as a case study in authentic versus performative populism. Rinder demonstrated real connection to working class experience, wrote one Oxford academic, while Farage's version was revealed as purely theatrical. International political commentators saw broader implications. This exchange perfectly captures the difference between genuine grassroots politics and manufactured outrage, wrote a columnist for the New York Times. Rinder's background gives him credibility that no amount of political theater can match. The impact extended beyond politics into popular culture. The clip was shared in WhatsApp groups across the country, discussed in pubs and workplaces, and became one of those rare moments that transcends party lines because it's fundamentally about human authenticity. Book publishers were reportedly interested in expanding Rinder's memoir to include more about his working-class background. Television producers began discussing potential political programs. University debate societies across the country started using the exchange as a masterclass in argumentation. But perhaps the most significant impact was on political discourse itself. Suddenly, politicians who had been copying Farage's style of aggressive populism found themselves being asked harder questions about their own backgrounds and credentials. The ordinary people versus elite narrative became much more complicated when audiences started asking which category the politicians themselves belonged to. Within days of the exchange, other politicians found themselves facing similar scrutiny. When a conservative MP tried to attack a university professor during a different debate show, audience members immediately started asking about the MP's own educational background. "You went to Eton and Oxford," one audience member pointed out. "How does that make you more in touch with ordinary people than someone who worked their way through state education?" The authenticity test became a new standard in political discourse. Social media users started fact-checking politicians' claims about their backgrounds, creating viral threads that compared their rhetoric with their actual life experiences. One particularly popular thread compared various politicians' claims about understanding working-class struggles with their actual childhood postcodes and school fees. Opposition research teams across all parties began digging deeper into rivals' backgrounds, looking for the kind of contradictions that had made Farage so vulnerable. Political advisors started warning their clients to be more careful about making assumptions about opponents' backgrounds. The change was particularly noticeable in how politicians talked about class and experience, where once they might have made sweeping generalizations about metropolitan elites, many now qualified their statements or avoided the topic entirely. The phrase, "I don't know Judge Rinder's background," but became a common disclaimer, acknowledging that assumptions about opponents could backfire spectacularly. Polling in the weeks following the exchange showed a noticeable shift in how voters evaluated political authenticity. Focus groups revealed that people were becoming more sophisticated in their analysis of politicians' claims about representing ordinary people. One participant in a post-exchange focus group said, "After watching Rinder destroy Farage, I started thinking more about who these politicians actually are, not just what they say they are." Reform UK's numbers dipped slightly in the immediate aftermath, but more significantly, their messaging became more cautious. Where once Farage might have made broad attacks on the establishment, his subsequent appearances showed more careful language and fewer assumptions about opponents' backgrounds. The Labour Party, which had often struggled to counter populist attacks on their metropolitan elite image, found new confidence in highlighting their MP's authentic working-class credentials. Several Labour politicians explicitly referenced the Rinder-Farage exchange when defending their right to speak about working-class issues. Conservative politicians, caught between their traditional base and the populist surge, found themselves having to navigate more carefully between anti-establishment rhetoric and their own privileged backgrounds. Several high-profile conservatives privately admitted that the exchange had made them reconsider how they talked about class and authenticity. The Liberal Democrats, often dismissed as the ultimate metropolitan elite party, began more aggressively promoting MPs and candidates with working-class backgrounds. Their leader explicitly referenced the exchange when announcing new candidate selection criteria, emphasizing authentic community connections over traditional qualifications. Even international politicians took notice. European populist leaders, who had been copying Farage's playbook, became more cautious about making assumptions about opponents. Several political consultants in America reported that clients were asking for more thorough background research on debate opponents after seeing what happened to Farage. The exchange also influenced how political debates were structured and moderated. Television producers began requiring more detailed background briefings for hosts, ensuring they understood panelists' personal histories before allowing attacks on their authenticity. Several debate formats explicitly included time for participants to establish their credentials before engaging in political argument. Law schools reported increased applications from candidates specifically mentioning the Rinder-Farage exchange as inspiration. "I want to be able to speak truth to power like that," became a common theme in personal statements. Legal aid organizations saw increased volunteer applications from law students wanting to follow Rinder's example of using legal skills for public service. The broader cultural impact extended into entertainment and media representation. Television dramas began featuring more characters with authentic working-class backgrounds in positions of authority, reflecting audience appetite for the kind of genuine experience Rinder had demonstrated. The exchange became a touchstone for discussions about immigration and refugee experiences in Britain. Schools began incorporating it into history lessons about post-war Britain, using Rinder's family story to illustrate how refugee communities had integrated and contributed to British society. Mental health advocates noted the positive impact of seeing someone handle aggressive confrontation with such composure and dignity. The exchange was used in therapeutic settings to demonstrate healthy responses to bullying and personal attacks. The long-term implications are still playing out, but political scientists are already identifying the Rinder effect, the increased scrutiny of political authenticity claims, and the raised bar for politicians claiming to represent ordinary people. As one academic noted, Farage thought he was attacking a typical member of the establishment. Instead, he discovered that the establishment sometimes includes people who got there the hard way, and they don't appreciate being lectured by those who didn't. The question time clash between Judge Rinder and Nigel Farage will be remembered as one of those rare moments when television captures something completely authentic, the collision between genuine experience and political performance, art. What made Rinder's response so devastating wasn't just the facts he presented, but the quiet authority with which he delivered them. Here was someone who didn't need to shout to be heard, didn't need to blame others to explain his success, and didn't need to perform authenticity because he had the real thing. Farage, for all his political skills, had made the classic mistake of assuming his opponent was just another member of the metropolitan elite he loved to attack. Instead, he found himself face to face with someone whose working-class credentials were unquestionable, and whose professional success was built on merit, not rhetoric. The exchange proved that in an age of political theater and manufactured outrage, there's still immense power in simple truth, delivered with confidence and backed by lived experience. It showed that the best way to deal with a bully isn't to shout back, it's to remain calm, stick to facts, and let your authenticity speak for itself. For viewers across Britain and beyond, the moment offered something increasingly rare in modern politics, a genuine surprise, delivered by someone who proved that the best comebacks aren't planned, they're earned through a lifetime of real experience and the confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. If you enjoyed watching this political masterclass unfold, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more moments when truth meets power and authenticity wins the day. Because in a world full of political performance art, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth.